Alright, sorry for the audio quality on the last episode. I uploaded the video, then noticed I'd left some mouse clicks in there, which I manually go through and edit out, but it was too late at that time to replace the video, because y'all liked it, and thanks so much. So now, every time you go back and listen to part 5, you're going to hear all those little mouse clicks, and it's going to annoy the shit out of you. I felt compelled to do more on this movie without waiting, because, I don't know, I'm just so into deciphering it now, or I think we've really cracked the surface and kind of getting at the juicy flesh inside. And also, I kind of want to move on to starting some best of the decade series videos, which I think could be really fun. Before we begin on this episode, and I think there's a lot of cool stuff in this next little bit, I want to point out one of the comments from Jace Pace left on the last video. If you'll remember, we were at a little bit of a loss for the interpretation of the contrail of the plane and the symbolism for like escaping via air and what's that mean for Utena and Anthy. Jace sees it as another person who's outside of Otri Academy or who has their life together, and therefore it would be unreachable by Anthy and Utena. It's somebody that, you know, isn't bound by the trauma of the prince. And that's why when Utena would look up and say, that's amazing, or the view is beautiful, or, you know, whatever she says admiring the view, that would be the thing that they're aspiring to do, or the person that they're aspiring to be. So maybe in that way we can see it not as like a temptation for an easy way out that we said with the suicide, but instead a goal or something, or that they want to end up being free like the birds. But then the other side of that coin is that it's not as simple as just wanting to be like that. They have to go out and make it happen. They can't just daydream about leaving and flying away like Anthy is doing. I think there's some element of that certainly in the plane, and I brought it up because I really like this idea. I don't feel that this necessarily is a comprehensive reading though, with the sound of the jet engine being associated with the plane and that tying back to the very real and very intense escape sequence that they need to go through with the car, and also the interpretation of the contrail being associated with Anthy's trauma and her pain, and the whole stuff I talked about with it being a blade. I guess if we disassociate the plane itself from anything involving any of those other things, then yeah, it would work in that way. But I don't think that I'm necessarily sold 100% on it being them looking upon a person outside of Otri Academy. I do, however, just love the idea that instead of showing a person who's divorced from the idea of the prince and, you know, setting up a big, like noble person who has it together or who isn't trapped in the bounds of Otri Academy, that Ikuni would really set it up to be just one line on the screen and a sound. That would totally be a beautiful and poetic interpretation of something that is unknowable to them. And sort of the idea of a hyper minimalist symbol is really appealing, but I think it's necessarily kind of a reach because of its very subdued nature. And I would guess that if Ikehara were to hear your theory, whether or not he did intend that as meaning in the film, he would very much be in favor of that reading. This one's a bit more fluff, but Toon King asks, what's my ranking of Ikehara's works? And, you know, barring the new show airing this spring, I think that's pretty quick just to go over Penguin Drum first, Adolescence of Utena second, the R movie, Sailor Moon S, Revolutionary Girl Utena, the series, the second half of Sailor Moon R, Sailor Moon Supers, and then Yuri Kuma down at the bottom. Alright, we're back onto Adolescence, and remember the last shot was Anthy revealing her gash to Utena in the red and black star color scheme. Now, remember the line right before this. Utena says, what is this? Now, consider the next 5 minutes of the movie to be end capped by Utena's exact same line of, what is this? And Anthy's response. Because of this one detail, we can interpret the rest of this segment of the film, this 5-minute chunk here, right before the duel of Utena and Juri, as being the very frivolous and very interpretive or symbolic exploration of Anthy sharing her pain to Utena. If you look at it this way, then it turns what is one of the most absurd and most ridiculous scenes in the entire series or in any anime whatsoever into something that's able to be understood and consumed and interpreted interpreted within the bounds of what the characters are having to deal with. Let's go shot by shot. We're in the broadcast booth again with Iko and Efko, who we know to be Utena and Anthy from, again, the end of the film. We talked about this back in the first and second videos, and we'll talk about it again later on. Iko says that there is a Mondo scandalous painting in the back of the headmaster's office, which, again, Utena literally just saw in the previous scene and asked Anthy about. Considering that painting was entirely associated with Anthy's tragedy, we then know that she hasn't shared that with anyone else. That's the whole point of closeting yourself away. Even if we didn't have that checkmate at the end of Utena and Anthy on the straw men after they escape, then we would still be able to interpret that Iko and Efko are Utena and Anthy by this revelation. And you'll note that Efko and Iko fall exactly into line with the kind of bantering back and forth that we saw played out in the previous scene. Because Efko inserts this scandalous tape. And yes, it's totally this inside joke about Nanami and how she was a bullshit character and she never mattered, but she really did back in the series, and that's its own separate thing. But this story just isn't about whatever Nanami's got going on. But instead of that, let's see this as Anthy's attempt to deflect away from the hard questions about her inner pain that Utena keeps pressing about. This is a giant metaphorical attempt for Anthy's attempts to filibuster Utena and her attempts to get to know Anthy. So I'm not going to give you a detailed breakdown of every scene where Nanami gets choo-choo stuck in her nose and what that could possibly mean. I don't think it has meaning, and I think Ikahara is one of the only directors ever in anime to really make effective use, maybe Hideaki Anno is the other one, of bullshit time or like completely nonsensical, no inherent purpose for the story that they're telling. And, you know, in that way, it does sort of have a purpose for the story they're telling, right? It's supposed to be confusing or disorienting or distract you from the matter at hand, like Anthy wants it to do. A lot can be said about this directing choice. Primarily what it does tonally to the film. I think that it's a already very symbolic, very hard to understand, very convoluted show. And then when you have something like this, you're gonna lose people or purposefully lose people. And I don't agree with that decision. And when you make a piece of media, I think that you should try and convey as best and as accurately as possible the message that you want to get across to people. That said, the ping-ponging back and forth amount of seriousness and playfulness and, frivolity with how Anthy deals with these types of things and how she hides them really paints a picture of how she not only guards herself, but also how she sees her trauma. This is done super well by Ikahara in Penguin Drum, where all the deep-seated pain is masked underneath the character's outer appearances, and the show itself uses the penguins as comedic relief to kind of mask the terrible, heavy trauma and otherwise morose subject matter of the show. While I don't like it, I can certainly respect the idea that it's difficult to get at these matters, and it's difficult for you, the viewer, to understand what's going on here, just as the same way that it's difficult for Utena to get Anthy to open up about these issues, or difficult for anyone to really deal with their inner demons and progress out of this adolescent hell that they're in. It's kind of a microcosm, right? The experience that you go through watching this movie is almost exactly what the characters go through struggling to deal with the issues in the movie. One of the more successful videos that I've done on my channel is breaking down Nier Automata, and a large part of that game is the same extra-diegetic manipulation. And this might be a tad hyperbolic, but this is kind of the highest rung of art, or the not the pinnacle, but kind of what you want to aspire to if you're making some creative narrative display. You want the audience to understand what the characters feel, right? What better way than making them experience what the characters are experiencing? And here, it's frustration. It's pushing past the bullshit and maintaining your cognizance enough, or maintaining your mental faculties enough to determine which thing is valuable and how you need to pressure that and understand that and really grasp onto it. So when Iko asks if that is really what the scandalous tape was, That's Utena saying, your projections that you've thrown up don't really have any meaning, and I can see through that. Tell me the real issue. And we get it. But first, there's also something I want to mention about this filibuster scene. Using Iko and Efko as radio announcers is pretty poignant. They're literally broadcasting their inner secrets out, right? Of course, she's only sharing it with Utena at the moment, but this is Anthy's innermost trauma. And later on, when we see the grave of Akio revealed, Shiori jumps in with the cassette tape, insinuating that she has the second one that Efko inserts with all the drama revealed. But however, she only has the first one, this one that we've just seen with Nanami. It's a clear indication that Anthy is one step ahead of Shiori, that Shiori thinks she's in on things, and later on we see the 3 shadow puppet girls instead of just Iko and Efko, implying that the 3rd shadow puppet announcer girl is Shiori. And I'm really spoiling one of the things that we want to talk about later in the scene, but absolutely Utena's vulnerability re Toga and how that got exposed to the world. I think you can tie back to Shiori eavesdropping in the same way in the radio announcements. So Utena's vulnerability got exposed, but Anthy, the evermore the streetwise one and the smarter one, took one step to avoid it. She knows how the game is played. And Anthy fucking played her like a fiddle by even recording this memory and putting it on this media, you know, whatever that means, divorced from the symbol of the cassette tape, and making it available to some other person other than herself. She then knows that it exists and that somebody's going to try and find it and look for it, and she knows that it's probably going to be Shiori. So this filibuster, while meaningless to us and to Utena, actually is the long con for Anthy protecting herself. Good God. I suppose if I were to give a breakdown of anything related to this scene, it would be the fact that Ikahara definitely knows how to do comedy and do it well when he wants to. The thing is, he doesn't often want to, and he's more interested in telling these kind of passionate stories about really heavy subject matter. However, I would encourage anyone interested in Ikahara's background or his directing style to go back and specifically watch episode 31 of the first season of Sailor Moon. It's an episode titled Luna's Worst Day Ever, and Ikahara actually won an award for this episode specifically, and it's just hilarious all the way through. And I think you can see some of that mentality in the Penguins and Penguin Drum, but also in this scene. So the tape of Akio, a number of things. First, it's kind of in the same way can be taken as the paintings that we saw earlier, as a reflection of what somebody saw, not exactly what happened. I don't think there's enough credence there for that. And specifically the things that it does, like repeating over the course of the film, give it a very ephemeral air and really hard to interpret as literal. But we can assume some things, like Akio was literally in the position of power. He was going to be the headmaster. He married the headmaster's daughter, or was engaged, and he's driving the red sports car. You know, it's very, very masculine and kind of fulfilling the idea of what everyone thinks the prince should be in Otri Academy. So this is the standard, really, of, you know, beautiful, powerful, graceful. He's competent and kind and smart, and the girls watching the memory make it very obvious, you know, or Eiko and Efko or Utena and Anthy looking back, that that's how everybody saw him. Again, we're called back to what we talked about with Tuxedo Mask earlier, what we talked about with the prince and the concept of the prince, and how Anthy manifests that with the Lord of the Flies. Eiko and Efko comment that, are you sure that it's a videotape? When, of course, no, it's not. It's Anthy's memory of what was going on. And then we're introduced to the idea of a key to start the car. This obviously comes back when Anthy inserts the key into Utena to start the car and, you know, leave Otri Academy. But a couple things to note here is that Akio doesn't have the key to start the car, and it's something that he looks for in this scene coming up. And I think I want to talk about it more in the context of the scene when Anthy starts Utena. But I suppose for now, what we want to think of with the key is, what does Anthy gain that Akio lacks here? I want to talk about a couple things specifically in this scene that might go unnoticed. Specifically the red and the black with the gray, the dark shadows, very stark shadows. Those are still here, and those are still very important for setting up kind of the darkness of this world, or the things lying in the shadows and the secrets and everything like that. I think Akio's outfit really reflects that too. The car metaphor definitely set up for later, right? And also this great comedic moment of of, him getting into the taxi, this fanciful guy being denied something or not being able to do something as the acting prince of the academy. And then you have the joke of him flipping across the hood of the car in the same way as he did the sports car, and that's hilarious and is another perfect example of what we were talking about earlier of how Ikuhara manages tone and also uses the duality of what's going on screen and the contrast to kind of set up the outside face. That's what he shows to the camera, and he looks directly into the camera as he says these things. So much like Anthy, Akio has obviously an outside face. When we get to the good part, we have kind of an interesting setup here. This shot in particular, there's this big metallic, or actually it's the edge of the canvas, right, of the paintings that would eventually hang in the headmaster's room, as we see one of them directly tied to what we saw earlier. And then it's kind of cutting off the screen, right, and leaving Akio on the right side of the screen. And he has the warmth light over by himself over there. But it's also, this whole scene is very, very dark stylistically, and using those kind of red highlights in sort of like a dripping blood manner. And in the second part of this scene, after the circle wipe transition, when it becomes private, Iko and Fko say, "I hear he takes care of his sister." So this is obviously not something that's shown to the outside world, and this is internal. Obviously, Anthy is the only one who would be privy to this, which further confirms that Iko and Fko are Utena and Anthy. Also, on the other side of the divide, the canvas divide from Akio, is Anthy. And on this thing of he takes great care of his sister, then we see Anthy in this type of body language, a young Anthy. And that is yikes. I'm trying to remember any time in any anime that I saw some body language that is so despondent or conveys something so well. Not just the contrast between what Fko is saying versus Anthy's body position, but just the body position itself. How you don't often see things like that. And look at the painting. Again, it's probably Anthy in her, ceremonial robe as the Rose Bride. But I think I would be doing a poor job if in the rape scene I didn't point out that the painting background looks like the folds of the labia. I really like the choice of the music of the waltz because it feels so flowy. It feels like something that just continues on and on and on. And it's even the dance that Akio does with his fiancée earlier in the scene. And this flowy, bouncy rhythm really allows the record skips to hit pretty hard. And it's a great way of kind of symbolizing the cracks in the facade, in the, perfect appearance of the prince. Also, the scandal starts here and the zoom-ins on Akio, showing that it starts from him, it originates from his own desires and his actions, and also that he's looking back into the camera, he's aware of us looking in on his sin, or at least, if this is Anthy's memory, looking at Anthy watching him drug the drink. Another thing to note about the second part of this scene is there's no establishing shot showing where the characters are in relation to one another. That's a visual trick that comes up again and again when we talked about the disappearance of Haruhi Suzumi and how that show used breaking the people in the same room apart by how they shoot the scene, and how that's used to show separation between the characters. The skipping record and the same measure playing over and over again is a really great build-up for the big reveal here. The shot of Anthy being cognizant and looking up right before the tablet goes into the water shows us all the context we need, that Akio was looking over at her to confirm she wasn't looking before he dropped the tablet into the water, but then she looked up and she was indeed, and that's what she saw. And so it's not only this whole big escalation in the same way as the jet engine was earlier on the reveal, but it's also kind of very quick back and forth of showing what happened specifically in this scene without explicitly telling us that she just barely saw him drop the ostensibly date rape drug into her drink. And the looping measure is not only unsettling, which really feeds into Utena's line of "what is this?" but it really shows, musically how much Anthy is stuck on this again and again and again. She can't move past this act. Remember, the prince that she came up with, that she created to be this force of good, to be grace and compassion unto the world, would do something like this, that would take this action. That she would be betrayed in this way. That everything about the person closest to her is a lie. Of course that's world altering, that changes your entire perspective. Of course that's enough to keep her dwelling on it again and again and unable to move past it and unable to get out of Otri. And I think my reading and my interpretation of this scene would kind of stop there. Had it not been for something that happened this past week. I was explaining this series and where I'm at with this scene and the drugging rape of Anthy to my friend Kura in the Discord, and Kura pointed out that he has a huge fondness for Akio as he appears in the series of Revolutionary Girl Utena. And I found it kind of passing odd because I don't really consider Akio meaningfully different, definitely more expounded upon in the series, but not fundamentally different than he is in the Adolescence of Utena. That is, he's something that Anthy needs to overcome. And the idea that she empowered him and she trapped herself in there, and it's kind of a self-inflicted wound, is just manifest in the character of Akio. He's a final boss and a representation of everything the prince should be, and the example of how that idealism of the prince kind of corrupts and feeds into the toxic masculinity of the social order building him up. And I think that's really carried out in Adolescence with the beginning of this scene that we talked about. Kura noted that there's some really interesting elements of series Akio in episode 34 of Revolutionary Girl Utena. That's the one with the Shadow Girl puppet play that they go see. And then young Utena seeing Anthy as the witch later on. And he specifically points out a couple of things, mainly in the beginning, where Akio says to Anthy after they're done having sex, "Why must you torture me so?" And then uses that to interpret the Shadow Girl's play as Akio's feelings of being captured as Dios and then made into Anthy's basically puppet, and how that gives series Akio a level of victimhood that we certainly don't see in Adolescence, where he's kind of just the bad guy, victimizing Anthy. And Kura suggests that the back and forth and the complex relationship between series Akio and series Anthy lends the character a whole nother level. I have a couple problems with his reading of this. First is that I don't think it's incompatible with Adolescence, or that everything that we assumed about series Akio can kind of be translated just as well into Adolescence Akio. That is, the scene of Anthy as witch is in both versions, and it's exactly the same. Dios, the perfect concept of the prince, cannot exist in the real world, and he's being hounded by the masses who, in the series, say, "Save my daughter, be the prince to my daughter so she can be a princess." And then Anthy's act of making him not exist anymore, or kind of, I guess, transforming him into Akio, is really the same too. It's made very clear in both versions that even if it is interpreted by people as a selfish act, whether that person be Akio or the society at large, that Anthy believes it to be an act of compassion, realizing that the ideal of the prince can exist and will be stretched too thin and will die because of it, that she saves him by releasing him from that, and she suffers society's wrath for it. The only difference is the Shadow Girl interpretation of the play and the way Akio behaves to Anthy. If you consider the Shadow Girl's play in episode 34 as what Akio is thinking, and I don't know that I do, as there's no direct link between Akio and the Shadow Puppet Girls, then yeah, you can consider that Akio has resentment for being made to be playing the prince. And that definitely jives with the line of, "Why do you torment me?" and then Anthy's wicked smile. And if that's the case, then we've certainly lost an element of Akio here. He's kind of just inflicting pain on Anthy, seemingly for his own desires or his desires to have power as the prince. Why does he rape Anthy here? There's really no explanation given, and his suicide is obviously because she found out and not because of anything else. Still, in both of these, there's an element of Akio being created by Anthy and being used by Anthy to play her prince until she can find another prince. She needs a prince to validate her worth as the Rose Bride, defining herself by what others think of her and how they use her. However, in Adolescence, he's already dead. He's not an actor on the story, something we talked about earlier, and for Toga as well. We're not given the time or the resources to kind of interpret Akio as pitiable in Adolescence. But I don't see this as a devolution of Akio's character, instead only as a refocusing of what the movie's about. Akio can still be spiteful, can be resentful, can be upset at Anthy for keeping him alive or preventing him from recapturing his glory days of being the prince, even though it was going to kill him. Unlike Toga, who fundamentally is completely rewritten for a different purpose in Adolescence than he is in the series, Akio and Akio's actions can take all that baggage. We can assume that not only did he want to sexually misappropriate Anthy, that he could partly do it out of spite and hatred towards her for what she did to him as the witch. In this way, it's much the same as Mickey and his baggage that's assumed from the series. What really was the relationship between Akio and Anthy? How much guilt does she still feel for what he perceives were slighted wrongs against him done by Anthy? I don't know. Adolescence doesn't say. And it's not a movie about that. It's a movie about the overcoming of that. Like, if you've seen it, Sound of the Sky, it's not about the giant apocalypse and everything that happened there. It's about how you get up the next morning and go on with your life. It's not a story about trauma. It's a story about the healing. Even though we just got done talking about how the movie sets up false distractions and everything, what I love about the film is it's focused and it doesn't set up anything that doesn't need to be there. The bullshittery and the distraction is part of the healing that they have to overcome. The details of the pain and whatever caused it, those don't matter. Before we move on to the fight scene, I think what's really difficult about the Adolescence of Utena and makes it really hard to appreciate on your first go around is that the climax of Anthy's motivation and all of her issues and everything related to her need to escape and being unable to happens in this one little shot, in this one little scene with this buildup. And it's great buildup, it's effective buildup, but it's not conveyed to the viewer very clearly at all. And yeah, with the benefit of a pause button, we can sit here and say, oh, how obvious. But once again, I think that's really not how real life goes. I think in a way that Ikuhara's decisions on the film really reflect the situation that Utena would be in being exposed to Anthy's tragedy. And for what it's worth, I think it totally comes through, even if we had to pry at it a bit. So I'm more than a little excited to move on to the next scene here. I know we're using a lot of superlatives, but I think this is one of the most content-dense scenes that has the most questions raised in it in the entire film. I definitely want to talk about everything related to it, and why it exists, why Utena duels at all, the temporal aspect of it, Shuri's position, why Utena turns into Dios, everything here, but it's going to have to wait until next time. Once again, thanks for listening to all this, and tune in next time as we go further in depth into the heart of the Adolescence of Utena.